All right, so now we're going to go ahead and organize this outliner here so it's not all full of madness. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to combine all this stuff so that it is going to bake properly, and how we need to set up our low poly. So we have these buttons here. And now that I'm looking at it, I think I actually need to separate my trim piece out. So let's do that first. So I'm going to just hide unselected. And I do still have my history here, but I think I can do this without worrying about that. So I'm gonna delete it. We're actually gonna end up deleting all of the history. So if I get too close, you can see it starts to clip. And there's a way to change that, but I can't remember exactly where. So I'm just gonna get as close as I can, and then we'll just figure it out. So what I need to do is basically select a strip of polygons there, and another one here. And then probably just like this one will be fine. So I don't need any of that stuff. And I don't need any of that stuff. So now these are two completely separate pieces of geometry. And I can just come over and do a separate. So now I have the trim and I have the button itself. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I have an idea. So there's this, I think there's like a rocker thing in here where it's like, if you were to look at it from the side, it would have kind of a curve right around here. So for this kind of thing, this is a perfect example of when a lattice is useful. So we can just come over here to create our lattice, and I'll make it like something simple. Go to our lattice point, and then I can just kind of bring it in a little bit. So it's going to be a bit linear, which maybe we don't want. Maybe better if it had a little bit more of like a gradual transition. So let's grab, whoops, need to make sure I right click over the lattice point itself. And we just get a little bit of a thing there. I think because I have such dense geometry, it's not really quite as smooth a transition as I would like. So there's another way we could go about this, which might work just as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab, try to find the middle face here. I think that's probably the center. And then we can go to our move tool, turn on soft select, and then reduce our, I think this piece is pretty small, reduce our value to some smallish number. Like this. Maybe we go to like 0.25. That's probably too much. And this way, this will give us like a much softer transition. We just have to find the appropriate value. So maybe like 0.15. And we'll get a little bit of a rocker pattern in there, which I think will be kind of cool. All right. Soft select for the win. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and show all of our geo that we just hid. So I'm going to select everything and hit Shift H. Looks like I missed somebody. So right now we've got stuff that's like kind of parked in these groups here, from separating and combining all the rest of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and select everything and hit Shift P. And that'll basically move everything out of any groups that it might be in. Like you can see now, this is all basically, these are just groups or empty transforms, and a transform is just a node that's like hanging on to this information, but it's not actually attached to any geometry. You can put geometry underneath the transform if you want, and then the geometry will be modified by the transform's information, but not necessary. So I'm just going to select all that stuff. We'll go to Edit, Delete, History, and you can see it cleans up all that stuff for me beautifully. So what we're going to do here is we're going to treat each button as an independent object, because they can be pushed up and down, right? So like hypothetically we might want to animate this thing, so we don't want these things to be built into the same geometry that the base of the controller is. So I'm just going to hide that stuff, and then all of this stuff here is going to be combined into a single piece of geometry. So I'm just going to go to Mesh, combine, and then edit, delete by type, and history. And I'm going to call this controller base high. Now the underscore high is very important. It'll become apparent why shortly, but basically we're going to create another piece of geometry here that's going to conform to the silhouette of this piece of geo. And that's going to be called controller base underscore low, and then Substance Painter is going to understand that when it does its baking, it's only going to have controller base high talk to controller base low. And this will, each button is going to have its own corresponding low poly, and we'll have the same arrangement for them as well. So we'll say button square underscore high, and then this is going to be button select underscore high, and then button start, and we'll call this one button B. Oops. Definitely need to put the underscore high at the end of it. And then this one, button underscore A high. You can have whatever you want on this side of underscore high, and it'll ignore everything. It just looks for, it just has to be the same for the high and the low. Cool. All right, so now everything here has a nice organized name, and let's see. Now we're going to go ahead, and we've got a few minutes. We're going to do a quick crash course on Retop. So I'm just going to go ahead and extend this out. We don't need to worry too much about what's going on with the reference at this point. So the basic idea of Retop is we have some high poly here, and we don't really have a low poly that we can easily grab from it, right? And this is totally normal, like to build something with the low poly in mind as a constraint on what you're doing for your high poly. It's just a really limited way of working, and you can see like it's been super easy to model this thing out, but if everything had to be on one mesh, like we'd be sad. It would be a lot more of a hassle. I'm actually going to make sure that this this text isn't floating quite that high. That might cause some trouble. We want it to be more or less flush with our surface. And I fear I may have captured some of this stuff here. So let me just turn on my wireframe. All right. There we go. And these may need to be modified as well. No, they're pretty close. Okay, cool. All right. Anyway, so as I was saying, we want to be able to make our high poly geo with all of the tools and tricks that we can use to make really cool high poly geo, and then we're going to create our low poly game res geometry completely from the high poly. We're not going to keep the low poly in mind from the beginning. It's completely irrelevant until the high poly is done. It's very routine for big changes to happen at the high poly phase, and if you're like, oh, I've got to maintain some relationship with some low poly mesh I built 6 weeks earlier, then it just turns into a giant pain. So that's an extremely old school way of doing it, and we don't do it that way anymore. So here's our high poly, and now we're going to go ahead and talk about creating the low poly geometry. So we have a couple of approaches here. When you have a primitive, right, like these things here are very, very, well, maybe not this one, but certainly the cylinders here. Those are very closely related to just a cylinder here that we can make. So we're probably not going to retop these. We can probably cut out some of these edges, and actually in this case fairly easily rebuild a very accurate low poly for this stuff. For this piece down here, that's where we're going to use a basic primitive, but for this one we'll go ahead and use Quadra just so I can show you what it's all about. If you had something that was more organic or complex, you probably would just end up using Quadra for the whole thing, but because these shapes here are so simple. Like for the fruit bowl assignment coming up next, you'd probably, well, I don't know, most likely we would use Quadra, but for something like a vehicle or a character or something, you're absolutely going to have to retop that, because the high poly is usually going to be kind of useless for grabbing edges and pulling stuff out. So anyway, okay, let's just pause it for now, and we'll pick up the actual approaches for recreating this as a low poly in the next video.